Okay, this is Reconstructing the Union, Objective 2, about the process of how the Union is actually reconstructed in a political sense. And if you look at the outline, letter A, it all starts with this guy, Andrew Johnson. Now you can read about all of his characteristics below there. He actually had been part of Abraham Lincoln's ticket during the second term during the election of 1864. If you remember, Lincoln had allied with war Democrats and created the new Unity Party. Johnson didn't do himself any favors showing up drunk at the inauguration. That was primarily, he had typhoid fever and people had recommended whiskey as a remedy, and he had taken a lot of it. He wasn't known as an alcoholic, it's just kind of the way it turned out. Now, in going down the characteristics there, you'll see that Johnson is a pretty stubborn guy. He's apprenticed as a tailor. He's not really well educated. He taught himself how to read, and his wife eventually taught him writing and arithmetic. But take a look at number 6 under letter A there. This is the big one. He's elected to Congress, and circle this. He's elected to Congress, and he stays with the Union after Tennessee secedes. He's kind of left as a man without a country. The South essentially hates him for this, and the North likes him, but they don't really think that he's on their side. They're not sure they can trust him. They would turn out to be pretty right about that later on. He was a big believer in the people. He liked states' rights, and he loved the Constitution enough that he used to give copies of it to visitors and also had it buried with him. The bottom line was that Johnson had a lot of qualifications, but he just was not somebody that fit in. He was not diplomatic in any way, so he didn't fit the role as a president. He was a Southerner who was now dealing with a Republican. He was a Southern Democrat who was now president for a Republican Congress and a Republican cabinet. It's made it pretty tough on him. Now, in the process, if you take a look at B and C here, in the process of reconstructing the Capitol Dome, the nation is being reconstructed too. And there are a series of plans. If you take a look at letter B, Lincoln has a plan of his own, believing that southern states had never legally left the Union. He thought it would be pretty easy to bring them back. So if you take a look at Lincoln's plan, the 10% plan, you can see there what he wanted them to do. Congress didn't like that plan. They thought that the South should be punished more, and came up with the Wade-Davis Bill of 1864, which Lincoln pocket vetoes. Now, down on number 3 on the outline, I want you to circle radical Republicans. That's a term that's going to be used a lot. The Republican Party splits, and the radical Republicans are the ones who felt the South had left the Union officially and needed to be treated as a conquered people. They thought Lincoln was too soft on them, and some were actually okay when Lincoln passed away. They had assumed that Johnson would be tougher on them because he hated big landowners in the South. They were really surprised with what they got. Now, this is primarily because old King Andy, if you take a look at letter C on the outline, was basically making the radical Republicans' greatest fears a reality. Again, taking a look at letter C here, during the Civil War, the southern states obviously weren't in the U.S. Congress, and mostly northern Republicans didn't want the newly elected congressmen, the southern reps, back. Now, Johnson had basically agreed with Lincoln's plan and allowed southern governments to form and send representatives back to Washington. If this was allowed to happen, Southern Democrats actually could possibly become more powerful after the war. The 3/5 compromise, if you take a look at C2B1 on the second sheet there, slavery ending meant the end of the 3/5 compromise as well. So you weren't just counting 3 of every 5 slaves toward the population, you were counting every slave as a part of the population. And with those increased population numbers, southern states could get more members of Congress and therefore more electoral college votes. If they were to get control of Congress by reuniting with the Northern Democrats, or if they were to get control of the presidency, they could completely undo everything that the Northern Republican Congress had set up. So when these governments show up in 1865, the Northern Republicans literally slammed the door in their face, disgusted by the fact they were even there. Some of them were former Confederate generals, former Confederate cabinet members, and members of the Confederate Congress, and the Confederate Vice President, Andrew Stevens. Now, Lincoln had his clashes with Congress, but he was gone now, and a lot of people felt he would have been easier to work with. The only thing left is basically his ghost sitting in Johnson's lap while he tries to figure all this out. If you take a look at letter D here, you can see a series of measures starting with the Freedmen's Bureau that Johnson vetoes and then is and his veto is overridden by Congress. Every move that Johnson makes, it's turning into a joke. I mean, everything he did was vetoed. When Congress passed the Civil Rights Bill for black citizenship rights in 1866, they were very afraid that if Southern governments got control of the presidency and Congress, they'd repeal the bill. So if you look in letter 3 there, they passed the 14th Amendment. And you can see the stipulations that were involved with that. Republicans, that states who were going to be part of the Union again, had to ratify the 14th Amendment. And the radical Republicans also wanted voting rights, but they accepted this measure as it was. Johnson, for his efforts, if you take a look at E there, spends a lot of time trying to give Southern Democrats support. It was called the Swing Round the Circle, where Johnson had given them a bunch of speeches, but those backfired. People mocked Johnson, and the Republicans even won more seats. And this is going to lead to the Reconstruction Act of 1867. Now, you can see on the map here, the South is going to be divided into military districts, each one commanded by a Union general and policed by Union soldiers. There were 20,000 of these throughout the South. Each state had to ratify the 14th Amendment. That didn't account for voting rights. That would come with the 15th Amendment of 1870. And each state, if you'll notice here, was readmitted by 1870 with Republican military leaders in charge. The problem is that when federal troops would leave, and this is, you want to underline this on 4A, the governments would fall back in the hands of the locals, and these local democratic governments became known as Redeemer or Home Rule governments. By 1877, the last troops would leave the South, and you're left with a series of states that are very solidly Democratic. No Republican candidate would win an election in the South, in any southern state, for another 100 years. Now, this measure was demanded by the radical Republicans who wanted to transform the South. The moderates didn't want the federal government to reach quite this far. They wanted to educate and create an electorate in each state, a group of people that would choose for itself to meet Reconstruction conditions. They didn't want it forced, but that's the way things turned out. I think it should be noted, too, that having these Reconstruction governments is what would make everybody in the South even more bitter towards the North. They didn't like being told what to do by military generals even after the war was over.